I was thinking about these presentations in comparison to the first group and how, especially the KPF model was a sort of the dream of these kinds of groups, as in you have these great tools and they get passed off and people use them, and it's perfect. What we're showing, at least in this case, is a lot of, well, we show tools, but we also show mostly project work, especially you guys, and I wonder if you have that same sort of model that you're going towards, as in ideally you can package things for the rest of the office to use, so you don't need to be, this group is the only one who can possibly make these kinds of projects. How do you see that expanding in your office?
Yeah, I would say, the short answer is yes, definitely. We are constantly thinking about deployments of some of this knowledge and the tools especially. We have Brian and Manzer from our LA office here that they have worked side by side with James and others in the team on the RAMS project. And there's kind of a slow dissemination and education of that kind of skill set through the office. And we are kind of in the throes of starting to understand how we can release some of the custom tools that we've created or tweaked, not only within the office, but to share with the community at large. Because much of what we began with was kind of on the backs of many people in this room and what they built. So that is kind of where we're headed, because there's only so many of us and we have a lot of work. Right?
Say something, guys.
Yeah, I mean, that's, it's funny because HKS and TT are almost the exact same size, actually. So we have sort of the same charge, I think. And that's how you have to start a group like this. I get this question many times. You can't put the stars necessarily with the group like we do. We start with that sort of low-hanging fruit and, really bottom up. And those are the types of things that everyone, at least the majority of the firm, will understand and will sort of latch onto. You can always do the R&D stuff, but I think the first thing that we do is just to build those low-hanging fruit tools that people can just like right away just click the button and something happens. They're better.
Yeah, I think we've seen an interesting progression, I guess. So 5-6 years ago when we started for Studio, well, it was then called Advanced Computational Modeling, we thought that we could teach 1,000 engineers how to, that Grasshopper is more important than Revit, essentially. That was kind of our vision of the future of TT. Turned out that, maybe, 3%, 5% took on to that. So we had sort of started this very Grasshopper-centric workflow, and in the end, it was still, it's like Daniel showed. Daniel is using that. I mean, people in our group are heavily using that workflow still because it's the best that we can do to realize these kind of projects. But we have, since then, in the last year especially, spent a lot of time, I think, developing more web-based applications like the ones that Ben just showed. And we really see that, everybody knows how to use a website and how to use an iPhone app. And so we really see that lets us get a way to let the rest of our office use sort of our tools more easily. It's also a lot more involved to design a web app than it is to design a little plugin for Revit or Dynamo or Grasshopper, but that's where we are currently, I guess, in 2016.
Might have to turn it on.
My question is to Robert, actually. You started to answer it, but a lot of us come from the design side, and a lot of your team is designers, right? They came from the architectural schools. So I'm curious about the interface between, yourself as a licensed engineer and some of the stuff, like how much trust is there between the actual licensed engineer sitting there reviewing some of these calculations that are almost coming out of a black box to make sure that, at the end of the day, some of the stuff that we design as designers, it's like, well, the engineer will help us figure it out. So there's that little bit of a safety net that, as you guys are, there are safety net, like how much that kind of, with the gray hairs and the young kids, how do you balance that? Yeah, I know we are.
Yeah. Well, I think that is the underlying goal. As an engineer, we, again, if you go back to the old days, when I first started, we used to get, a design put in front of us, we'd have to respond. And and that response would be too long to have any kind of informed sort of information for the architect to make the next move. So I think the goal of an engineer is really to get deep inside the psyche and the mindset, design, vision of the architect, while having the sort of performative analysis being done in the background. And so yes, to answer your question, we have to build these tools on a very granular level. We do a lot of testing. And so that is the ultimate goal, right? To be one thing, I think, at the end of the day, the engineer, architect, contractor, that gets blurred in a way and sort of informs each other.
Thanks.
Great presentations, guys. And super great day, so thanks for the audience and all the participation. Kind of in the same line, how do you see, I mean, we're at this point now where it's not about Rhino, Grasshopper, it's not about Rode, it's about this combination of these things, and the industry is changing. It's about taking the knowledge that used to be embedded in a particular application, opening it up in different ways. How do you cultivate that culturally inside of your office? This idea of like, here's this thing that I made, kind of the same idea of like a black box, like how do you gain trust? But then also how do you share that information more? Like, I mean, like case in point, like the Weidlinger stuff, like open sourcing a lot of stuff that actually is IP, right? That's like intellectual property, that's our secret sauce. It's actually beneficial to get it out there. It seems like there's a change in thought process and philosophy, not just at TT, but across the industry. Do you have any thoughts on where that's going or how that's going to progress?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's everything that we build in terms of whether it's open source or whether we use it to our competitive advantage. Each topic that we take is sort of case by case. And we've open sourced some things, other things we haven't, partially because when you get into the engineering realm, it gets a little bit dangerous when you're giving the engineering tool to someone who may not know how to thoroughly use that tool in the right way. So we're just starting to get into that space, and I think that's what we don't know, to be completely honest.
I'm glad you brought up the open source thing, Mac, and I think in-house we've seen some buy-in from people who, on any level, can read source code. Once it goes from a black box to, big control, it's all written down, computer executes these things one by one, you do get a little bit more trust because it's understood as something that's lasting, that can be sort of changed over time and improved and dialed in based on user feedback and testing. So, I don't know, even at the graphical programming level, it's hard to get buy-in, but I think once you do, even like Rob said, with the really low-hanging fruit problems, you start to develop relationships and trust gets there, and it becomes this back and forth between sort of nitty-gritty Excel engineers and people who are kind of closer to the design side like us.
Hi. A lot of what you guys, both you guys, and really throughout the day showed were very, came at it from a project context. And I was curious, sort of along the same lines, how much of these kind of one-off project-specific tools and workflows can be realistically extracted into a more generic, reusable tool, or is every project kind of deserving of its own kind of problem-solving methods in doing that? And is that a struggle in kind of thinking about how to, gain trust and really scale the applications of this? Are there similar themes in facade rationalization and kind of geometry problems and kind of fabrication stuff that really deserve a more kind of broader look at how to solve these problems in a repeatable way rather than from a project-to-project thing?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I'll try. I think some of it's experience-based. You have to go through this with project teams and see what works and what doesn't. And take what works and try to apply it to another project and see if it works there, what the overlap is. And I think, unfortunately, it's a kind of a long time scale to understand what the patterns are for what should be abstracted, what should be sort of
I think it's great that we're both up here. 'Cause from an engineering standpoint, I think it's way easier because the criteria is very straightforward. From an architectural standpoint, I'm glad you guys are here. I hope you guys will try to answer this. It's much harder because the criteria is always different, and architects almost as a rule try to subvert whatever you try to make as a tool. That's almost your job. I'm curious if you guys feel the same way.
Well, I mean, there's two areas. There's like the basic little tools that you might generate in Grasshopper within the case of the Obis project. For us, that's more, that framework is a library. So the development that grows with every project, and sometimes when there's an opportunity, it's getting sort of similar to the way that Mustafa is examining his work, is what is that source code and how can I make it better and more modular, and knowing that I'm going to reuse it and that I need to interface with other projects and even other libraries, then how can I best do that, and all the time keeping efficiency in mind. But I think it's not so much for me the development of a tool per se as much as it is that library, and even insofar as like definitions, like Grasshopper definitions, is how can you set that up even in that way that it becomes modular enough that it's not project specific. I mean, that's not always possible, but I think that's the mindset I at least try to approach it with.
Thanks. This is a question for the HKS Line guys. So thinking about the digital fabrication project that you guys did with all these panels, you ultimately you built this design tool that helped you explore your design throughout the process, but ultimately you handed over, rather than a set of drawings to fabricators, it sounded like you basically gave them exactly the right information that they needed so that they could plug it into their fabrication system and fabricate digitally. So my question, and this kind of ties in with the idea of building tools that we can replicate and use again as design tools. This is kind of looking at the industry as a whole. Everyone in this room, this is a technology conversation, so we're all interested in innovating and pushing our industry forward. But I'm curious about two things. One of which is basically how did your legal team feel about you guys? Basically, instead of, the reason that we typically put drawings together, sure, there are hundreds of drawings in a typical set for a building of that scale that actually aren't necessary to construction. They're more to accompany the architect in liability kind of situations. So my first question is, how did your legal team feel about handing over that type of information, which is probably not a format that they're used to dealing with or structuring agreements with fabricators directly? And second, if that's kind of maybe, I don't know, thinking about the way contracts tend to be written to kind of not even manage the risk of architects, but to minimize the risk of architects. But of course, here's a reward that you were able to kind of cash in on by taking that risk. How does a group like us, of people interested in moving our industry forward, how do we have that conversation with basically our legal departments and say this is a major benefit if we're able to take on that type of risk and that type of responsibility?
I'll hand it over to Ethan in a minute to talk about the liability concerns, but first off, so first, those text files that you'll produce, they're not G-code, right? So G-code is the actual instruction, and this is somewhere more kind of between ground where it's kind of discrete description. And I think that this is an opportunity, hopefully, to kind of speculate with everyone and toss out the question as to, is that something that maybe there's a larger opportunity for in other types of geometry aside from just three-point triangles, but how is it that we can start to describe things in terms of some sort of discrete geometric definition that there's maybe an agreed upon standard at some point and an interpreter that is able to interpret those discrete definitions into something that's manufacturing specific. So if there were, for instance, something that could go to directly to G-code for a specific machine, that would be more favorable than describing, like in the case of like if you want to 3D print an STL mesh, you have to go through this whole slicing operation rather than going directly to whatever the paths are. But I mean, like say for instance, if you in KR, how would you generate KR directly from the description rather than from from a series of parameters rather than from the mesh itself. And I think that's something that we should all be thinking about, and there's a lot of opportunities, but I don't really have a clear answer for. But in terms of liability, I think we've been doing some work that Keith can speak to more eloquently.
Yeah, really the way we broached the subject with the legal team, we were coming off the heels of the Vikings project, where in a sense we were kind of bound by the contract that was written before we fully understood what the opportunities or the requirements of the project might be. Essentially, coming to light for everyone to understand was that 1/16-inch paper drawings were virtually useless to the fabricator. But contractually, we were not allowed to provide a model as a document of service. So in anticipation of the LA Rams project coming in, I began to talk with the attorneys that we have on staff. And really, probably the largest hurdle was just communicating between an attorney and an architect or designer that our intent wasn't necessarily to hand over a Revit model as, go build a building off of this, because there could be a lot of additional liability there. The way we build models is not always really tight. But through a series of conversations, including project managers and kind of showing them and explaining what we were trying to do in terms of delivering a CSV file or three-dimensional geometry or really anything, we determined that this was necessary. So we took the steps to call the California board. We explained to them what we would like to do. We would like to be able to have the full ability to deliver electronic documents as instruments of service. They gave us kind of the go-ahead, said it sounds good, show us how you might do that. So it was really kind of simply from that point understanding how can we build a prototype that says how we can electronically seal a digital or electronic document. And they said okay, and we kind of set that in place so that we could use it on this project. I think through a symposium or consortium of us, Digital Fabrication Network is one of those that we've tried to work with. I think state by state is how that's going to happen. The jurisdiction of individual localities to kind of come together and start to change and open this up further across the United States is really, from a policy standpoint, how that will happen. But what we have is not that complicated. It's really fairly simple, but we are sharing that freely with anyone who's interested. So,
Great. Thank you.
All right, we're going to give some closing remarks, but let's thank our speakers first. Thanks, guys.
The only closing remark that I had was to thank everyone for coming, to thank the speakers who always seem to exceed expectations, and also to our sponsors, Grimshaw, Autodesk, and Bruce Baggett, for really putting on both great presentations but also really good workshops. So I think every year for us is a learning curve in terms of how we do it and when we do it. But I think we will continue this. And for sort of logistically, I'm looking at Shannon. For the hackathon, is there any specific location that they need to